Russian Roulette. A Geist the Sin Eater's story. Johnny Hammer lay face down in a pool of his own blood. He wasn't alone, but none of the other bodies stretched out in the alley behind Rosie's were breathing. Not anymore. No, Johnny's Widowmaker had taken care of that. He didn't know the men, had never seen them before a few minutes ago, but the shooters knew him well enough that they'd opened up as soon as they'd caught sight of his face. He had lead in his guts, his shoulder, and through at least one lung. They'd missed his heart and his head. The same could not be said about his own gun work. It had been years since Johnny had walked out on Tony Gracchus. He'd pulled stakes, moved cities, even changed his old name, and he was just starting to think that maybe he'd slipped through the cracks. That maybe Tony was as sloppy as everybody had said, and he wasn't going to do anything about one stray shooter drifting in the breeze. But every one of the bodies sharing the alley with him had a black serpent tattooed on the back of their gun hand. A mark Johnny had refused when Tony had taken over for his old man, and insisted that all of the old guard prove their loyalty to the new head of the family. Johnny's eyes were getting heavy. It hurt to breathe, but not as much as it had before. He bit his bottom lip hard enough to split the skin, and the little shock was enough to wake him up a bit. He focused on that pain and clutched it tight. He had to get up. He had to get moving before somebody came to finish what the first crew had started. No sooner had that thought crossed his mind than he heard footsteps. They weren't coming from the street, though. They were coming from behind him. Johnny tried to look over his shoulder, but his head felt like a too big bowling ball. His eyes darted around, trying to find where he dropped his gun. The Ruger lay on its side, the blue finish on the barrel catching the halogen light from the bar's back door. It was out of bullets, but whoever was coming up behind him didn't know that. Johnny had his fingers on the old, worn grip when he heard a voice that sent a chill up his spine.
"That smoke wagon won't do you no good, Johnny," the voice said. "Not where you're going."
A hand grabbed Johnny by the collar of his jacket, lifting him off the ground. Fresh blood ran from his stomach, and white, hot needles jabbed through his brain as every part of him tried to make itself heard at once. Whoever had picked him up laid him against the wall. Johnny gritted his teeth against the stars that went off behind his eyes. When he blinked the bright lights away, though, he wondered if he wasn't still seeing things. A man made of death stood over Johnny. He was long and gaunt, with rawhide skin and thin, greasy hair. An old, wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over his face, and he was wrapped in a worn leather coat. His square-toed boots were run down and resoled, but they were stained nearly to the ankle, as if the man had walked across a river of blood. He smelled like burnt powder and the metallic tang of old brass. Johnny tried to get his breath, to spit something out, but he couldn't seem to get any wind.
"That's a sucking wound you've got,"
the man said. He drew a cigarillo from an inside pocket and tapped the tip against the back of his hand.
"It's gonna kill you another minute or two, but I could stop it if you want me to."
The man stuck the smoke in his mouth and held a cupped flame in his hand. There were no eyes above his mouth, just a pair of black, round holes. He breathed in, and smoke trickled from those holes like hot gun barrels. He grinned down at Johnny, and his smile was made of gleaming cartridges in a dozen different calibers. The flame snuffed, and he blew out a breath. It smelled like cordite and violence.
"You made yourself a lot of enemies, Johnny,"
the thing with the gun barrel gaze said.
"Seems like it might be time you had a friend."
He crouched down and picked up Johnny's shooter. With a flick of a wrist, he opened the cylinder and let the empty casings fall. They tinkled on the broken blacktop like little choir bells. He pulled back his coat, revealing a black gun belt. With deft fingers, the man plucked 6 old shells from the belt and slipped them into the Ruger. The shells rolled over his fingers like a magic trick, glimmering in the halogen light as each one nestled into place. The creature flicked its wrist again, and the cylinder slid home once more. He offered Johnny his weapon, but first. "What?" Johnny managed, blood oozing over his bottom lip. "Do you get?"
"I don't want your soul, Johnny."
The thing offered another flash of its hollow-point smile.
"Just your hands. There's a lot of people who need to be put in the ground."
Johnny hesitated. His vision started going dark, and the world around him went fuzzy. He reached for the revolver the way a drowning man would claw at a life vest. His fingers slipped around the trigger, and the six-gun saint laughed. It was the dry, clicking sound of an empty chamber.
"Good choice,"
the creature whispered. It began to fade, its edges blurring as it writhed and billowed. The saint came apart, and oily, gray smoke roiled from the rents in its form. The smoke slid up Johnny's nose and down his throat. It caressed his skin and pushed into his wounds. It burned, and it soothed at the same time. The flow of blood slowed to a trickle, then stopped. Johnny's breathing evened out, and the world came back into sharp focus. It still hurt, but he wasn't dying. Not the way he had been, at least.
"On your feet, Johnny,"
the saint whispered in his ear.
"We've got work to do."